The wind howled like a wounded animal as Elizabeth Kincaid stumbled through knee-deep snow, her vision blurred by the relentless blizzard that had descended upon Wyoming Territory without warning. It was January 1878, and what had begun as a clear winter morning had transformed into a merciless white nightmare that threatened to claim her life with each labored step. Elizabeth had never imagined that her journey to visit her ailing aunt in Red Bluff, Montana, would end like this. The stagecoach had been forced to stop when one of the wheels broke, and the driver had insisted they were only 3 miles from the next station. "Stay put," he had urged as he and his assistant set off to bring back help. But as hours passed and the temperature plummeted, Elizabeth had made the fateful decision to try reaching the station herself. Now, with her fingers numb and her thoughts growing sluggish, she knew she had made a terrible mistake. The elegant blue woolen traveling dress that had seemed so practical in San Francisco now clung to her like a death shroud, heavy with ice and snow. Her valise had been abandoned miles back, too heavy to carry through the deepening drifts. "Just keep moving," she whispered through cracked lips, the words immediately stolen by the wind. The distant shape of what might have been a stand of trees or merely her imagination wavered before her. With the last of her strength, Elizabeth pushed forward, collapsing against what she now realized was a wooden structure, a small barn or outbuilding of some kind. Her frozen fingers fumbled with the latch, but it refused to budge. As darkness closed in around the edges of her vision, Elizabeth slid down against the door, her consciousness fading as the cold embraced her in its deadly arms. Declan Yates pulled his hat lower against the driving snow as he urged his horse through the blizzard. At 28, he'd seen his share of Wyoming winters, but this storm was particularly vicious. He'd been out checking on a section of his fence line when the storm hit, and now he was fighting his way back to his small homestead, guided only by instinct and his horse Thunder's uncanny sense of direction. The fading light made it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead, but years of ranching had taught Declan to trust his gut. Something wasn't right. Thunder snorted and pulled to the left, away from the direct path home. "What is it, boy?" Declan leaned forward, squinting through the swirling white. That's when he saw a splash of blue against the pristine snow near his storage shed about 100 yards from his cabin. Dismounting quickly, Declan trudged through the drifts. His heart nearly stopped when he realized who it was. A woman nearly buried in snow, her face pale as death, lips blue with cold. "Madam," he called, kneeling beside her still form. "Madam, can you hear me?" No response. Pressing his fingers to her neck, he felt the faintest flutter of a pulse. She was alive, but barely. Without hesitation, Declan scooped her into his arms, shocked at how light she felt despite her sodden clothing. The journey back to his cabin seemed interminable, but finally the welcoming glow of his homestead appeared through the curtain of snow. Once inside, Declan laid the woman carefully on the bearskin rug before his fireplace, which thankfully still held glowing embers. He quickly built up the fire, the flames soon leaping high and casting dancing shadows across the woman's ashen face. She was beautiful, he noted with a start, despite her current state delicate features, long lashes resting against pale cheeks and dark hair escaping from what must have once been an elegant coiffure. But admiring her beauty would have to wait. Declan knew the woman's wet clothes were killing her as surely as if she'd been shot. With practiced efficiency born from years of frontier living, he began to remove her outer garments, his rough hands working with surprising gentleness on buttons and hooks. "I apologize for the impropriety, madam," he murmured, though she couldn't hear him, "but I don't aim to have you die from cold on my floor." Once he had removed her sodden dress, petticoats, and stockings, Declan wrapped her in several warm blankets and his own spare quilt. He chafed her hands and feet, noting with concern the waxy appearance of her skin. Frostbite was a real danger, and he'd seen men lose fingers and toes to less. For hours, Declan worked tirelessly, applying warm compresses to her extremities, carefully monitoring her breathing and maintaining the fire at a steady blaze. Outside, the blizzard continued its assault, but inside his small cabin, a different kind of battle was being waged. It was nearly midnight when the woman stirred for the first time, A small moan escaped her lips and her eyelids fluttered. "That's it," Declan encouraged softly. "Come back now." Slowly, painfully, her eyes opened the clearest shade of green he'd ever seen, like spring leaves after a rain shower. They focused on him with confusion and the barest hint of fear. "You're safe," he assured her quickly. "I found you half frozen outside my shed. I'm Declan Yates. This is my homestead about 15 miles outside of Laramie." The woman tried to speak, but only a harsh croak emerged. Declan quickly fetched a cup of warm broth he'd kept simmering on the stove. "Small sips," he instructed, supporting her head with one hand while holding the cup to her lips with the other. "Don't try to talk yet." After she'd managed a few swallows, she whispered, Elizabeth Kincaid." "Miss Kincaid," Declan acknowledged with a nod. "You're mighty lucky to be alive. How'd you end up caught in that blizzard?" Elizabeth explained her situation in halting sentences, each word seeming to cost her precious energy. Declan listened intently, his weathered face grave. "The stage driver and his man probably made it to the station," he told her. "But in this storm, there's no way anyone's coming looking for you tonight. You're welcome to my hospitality until they can fetch you." "Thank you," Elizabeth murmured, her eyelids growing heavy again. "I'm sorry to impose." "No imposition," Declan replied, but she had already drifted back to sleep, her breathing steadier now. As the night deepened, Declan maintained his vigil, dozing occasionally in his chair but always waking to check on his unexpected guest. The storm showed no signs of abating, the wind occasionally rattling the shutters with renewed fury. By dawn, another foot of snow had accumulated outside, effectively cutting off the small cabin from the rest of the world. Elizabeth woke with the first light, more alert than before but racked with pain as circulation returned to her extremities. She gasped, tears springing to her eyes. "It hurts," she whispered, looking at Declan with a mixture of confusion and gratitude. "That's a good sign," he told her, handing her a cup of strong, sweet coffee. "Means you'll keep all your fingers and toes. The pain means they're coming back to life." Elizabeth took a tentative sip of the coffee, wincing at both the bitter taste and the pins and needles sensation in her hands. For the first time, she became fully aware of her state of undress beneath the blankets, and a flush spread across her cheeks. "My clothes." She began hesitantly. "Hanging to dry," Declan explained, a slight redness appearing beneath his tanned skin as well. "I had to get you out of them, they were soaked through. I've got a spare shirt you can wear until yours are dry if you'd like." "Yes, please," Elizabeth replied, mortified at her situation yet understanding the necessity of what he'd done. Had the positions been reversed, she would have done the same to save a life. Declan retrieved a faded blue flannel shirt from a chest and respectfully turned his back as Elizabeth struggled into it, the simple movement exhausting her limited strength. "I'm decent now," she announced, and Declan turned back, his expression carefully neutral though his eyes betrayed a momentary appreciation for how the oversized garment somehow enhanced her femininity rather than diminishing it. "Hungry?" he asked, moving to the small stove where a pot of something fragrant was simmering. "Nothing fancy, just beans and bacon, but it'll put some warmth back in you." Elizabeth nodded, suddenly aware of a gnawing hunger. "How long do you think the storm will last?" Declan glanced toward the window, which showed nothing but a wall of white. "Hard to say. Could clear by afternoon, could last 3 days. Wyoming blizzards have a mind of their own." As he ladled the simple meal into a wooden bowl, Elizabeth took the opportunity to study her rescuer. Declan Yates was tall and lean, with broad shoulders that spoke of a lifetime of physical labor. His face was tanned and weathered from the elements, with lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled often, though he wore a serious expression now. Dark brown hair, a bit too long, curled slightly at his collar, and a neatly trimmed beard framed a strong jaw. He moved with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin, at home in this harsh environment. "Thank you," she said as he handed her the bowl. "Not just for the food." "For saving my life." Declan's expression softened. "No need for thanks, anyone would have done the same." "But it wasn't anyone," Elizabeth pointed out. "It was you, if you hadn't found me when you did." "Best not to dwell on what might have been," he interrupted gently. "You're here now, and you're getting stronger by the hour. That's what matters." They ate in companionable silence, the howling of the wind the only sound beyond the crackling of the fire. When Elizabeth had finished her meal, she leaned back against the pillow Declan had provided, studying the cabin with interest. It was small but remarkably tidy for a bachelor's dwelling. A single room served as kitchen, dining area, and sleeping quarters, with a sturdy table and 2 chairs occupying one corner, a narrow bed pushed against the far wall, and the stone fireplace dominating the opposite end. Shelves lined one wall, holding books, tools, and sundry supplies. A rifle and shotgun hung on pegs near the door, alongside a heavy winter coat and various other garments. "Have you lived here long?" Elizabeth asked, curious about this man who had so unexpectedly entered her life. Declan nodded, taking a seat in the chair he'd positioned near her makeshift bed by the fire. "Going on 5 years now. Came west after the war, worked as a hand on a few ranches, then staked my claim on this patch of land. It's not much, but it's mine. You live here alone." The question slipped out before Elizabeth could consider its propriety. If Declan was offended, he didn't show it. "Just me and Thunder, my horse, and a few head of cattle. Oh, and Ranger." He gestured to a large dog that Elizabeth hadn't noticed before, sleeping in a corner. "He was out in the barn when I found you, or he'd have been the one to alert me." "No wife, family," Elizabeth pressed, then immediately regretted her boldness. "I'm sorry, that's none of my business." "No offense taken," Declan assured her. "Had a wife once back in Pennsylvania, Sarah. She died of fever while I was away fighting. No children, thankfully, would have been harder to leave if there had been." The simple statement, delivered without self-pity, touched Elizabeth deeply. "I'm sorry for your loss." Declan shrugged, his eyes momentarily distant. "It was a long time ago." "What about you, Miss Kincaid? What brings a clearly educated and refined woman to this part of the country, traveling alone?" Elizabeth explained about her aunt in Red Bluff, Montana, a formidable woman who had ventured west 30 years earlier as a young bride and remained even after being widowed. "She raised me after my parents died," Elizabeth continued. "Sent me back east for schooling when I was 12, but we've always remained close through letters. When I received word she was ill, I knew I had to come." "That's quite a journey for a woman alone," Declan observed. Elizabeth smiled wryly. "Aunt Margaret would say that's precisely why I should make it. She's never believed a woman should be limited by convention." "Sounds like a remarkable woman," Declan said with genuine admiration. "She is," Elizabeth agreed, then frowned. "I hope she's not worrying about me." "The stage was due in Red Bluff tomorrow, I mean today. Once the weather clears, we'll get word to her," Declan promised. "For now, you should rest. Your body's been through an ordeal." Though she wanted to protest, Elizabeth couldn't deny her exhaustion. Her eyelids grew heavy, and she soon drifted off to sleep, comforted by the steady presence of the quiet cowboy who had saved her life. The blizzard raged for 2 more days, confining them to the small cabin. As Elizabeth's strength returned, she insisted on helping with the daily chores, cooking simple meals, mending Declan's work shirts, and keeping the fire stoked. For his part, Declan ventured out only to tend to Thunder and his small herd of cattle, returning with cheeks ruddy from cold but a smile warming his face when he stepped inside to find Elizabeth waiting. They talked for hours during those days of enforced proximity, sharing stories of their pasts and dreams for the future. Elizabeth spoke of her time at a women's college in Massachusetts, her work as a teacher in San Francisco, and her secret ambition to write stories of the frontier for Eastern newspapers. "People back east have such romantic notions about the West," she explained on the evening of the second day as they sat before the fire, drinking coffee. "They imagine it's all gunfights and gold rushes. They don't understand the reality, the hard work, the isolation, the beauty of it all." Declan nodded thoughtfully. "And what about you, Miss Kincaid? Has the reality matched your expectations?" Elizabeth considered the question. "Parts of it have. The landscape is every bit as magnificent as I'd imagined, but I didn't anticipate." She paused, searching for the right words. "The harshness," Declan suggested. "No, not that. I knew it would be challenging. What I didn't expect was the sense of freedom. Even facing death in that blizzard, there was something exhilarating about being so far from the constraints of society." Declan's eyes crinkled at the corners. "Most people who come west are running from something or toward something. Which are you, Miss Kincaid?" The question caught Elizabeth off guard. She had never considered her journey in those terms. Perhaps a bit of both, she admitted after a moment. Running from the expectations of what a woman of my age and background should be and toward something I can't quite name yet. Freedom has a way of helping you figure that out, Declan said softly. On the morning of the third day, they awoke to silence. The wind had died during the night, and weak sunlight filtered through the frost-covered windows. Storm's broken, Declan announced after returning from checking his livestock. Road to Laramie will still be impassable for a few days, but we can get word to town that you're safe. Elizabeth felt a curious mixture of relief and disappointment. The enforced intimacy of their shelter from the storm had created a bubble of warmth and connection that she was reluctant to leave. I should write to my aunt, she said, pushing aside her conflicted feelings. She must be beside herself with worry. Declan provided paper and a pencil, and Elizabeth composed a brief note explaining her situation and assuring her aunt that she would continue her journey as soon as possible. Declan promised to have it delivered to the telegraph office in Laramie by a neighbor whose property lay between his homestead and town. True to his word, Declan set out later that morning, following a trail only he could discern through the deep snow. Elizabeth watched from the doorway as he disappeared into the distance, struck by how much she had come to rely on his steady presence in just a few days. Left alone, Elizabeth busied herself with cleaning the cabin, determined to repay Declan's hospitality in some small way. She scrubbed the wooden floor, organized his meager pantry, and prepared a more elaborate dinner than they had enjoyed thus far, using the ingredients at hand to create a savory stew. It was nearly dusk when Ranger suddenly lifted his head from his paws and trotted to the door, tail wagging. Moments later, Elizabeth heard the crunch of footsteps in snow, and her heart inexplicably quickened. Declan stomped the snow from his boots before entering, his cheeks red from cold but his eyes bright. "Message is on its way," he announced, "and I bring news." The stagecoach driver and his assistant made it to the station safely. They sent out search parties for you, but the storm drove them back. They presumed. He hesitated. That I had perished, Elizabeth finished for him. It was a reasonable assumption, I nearly did. Declan nodded, removing his heavy coat and hanging it by the door. I informed them of your whereabouts. They'll send word to Red Bluff that you're safe. As for continuing your journey, the station master thinks it'll be at least a week before the roads are passable enough for the stage to run again. A week? The news should have dismayed Elizabeth, anxious as she was to reach her aunt. Instead, she felt a flutter of something like pleasure at the prospect of more time with Declan. I've imposed on your hospitality long enough, she said, feeling obliged to offer an alternative. Perhaps I could stay at the station once a path is cleared. Nonsense, Declan replied firmly. The station's nothing but a drafty room above the stables. You're welcome here until the stage can run, unless... A shadow of doubt crossed his face, unless you'd be more comfortable elsewhere. No, Elizabeth said quickly, perhaps too quickly. I mean, if you're certain I'm not a burden, I would prefer to stay. You've been very kind. The smile that broke across Declan's face warmed her more than the fire. Then it's settled. Now what's that I smell? Something a sight better than my usual fare, I'd wager. Elizabeth laughed, relaxing into the easy companionship they had established. I hope so. It's the least I could do to thank you. Over dinner, Declan shared news from town, mundane matters of supplies delayed and neighbors checking on one another after the storm. Elizabeth listened attentively, asking questions about the people he mentioned, gradually building a picture of the community she had stumbled into. Town's organizing a social for next weekend, once the roads are clearer, Declan mentioned as they washed dishes together afterward. Nothing fancy, just a gathering at the schoolhouse with food and maybe some music. Would you? That is, if you're still here, would you like to attend? The invitation was casual, but Elizabeth didn't miss the slight hesitation in his voice or the way he focused intently on drying a plate rather than meeting her eyes. I'd like that very much, she replied softly, though I don't have anything suitable to wear for a social. Declan glanced at her then, his eyes warm. You look just fine in what you have. Folks around here aren't much for fancy dress. Elizabeth smiled, thinking of her simple traveling dress, now cleaned and mended after its ordeal in the snow. Then I accept your invitation, Mr. Yates. Declan, he corrected her gently. After pulling you from a blizzard and sharing quarters for days, I think we've moved beyond formalities, don't you? Declan, Elizabeth repeated, liking the feel of his name on her lips. And you must call me Elizabeth. That night, as she lay in the makeshift bed by the fire that Declan had insisted she continue to occupy while he slept on a pallet in the corner, Elizabeth found herself unable to sleep. The realization of how drastically her circumstances had changed in just a few days left her dizzy. A week ago, she had been on a stagecoach, anxious about her aunt and dreading the prospect of potentially having to settle the old woman's affairs. Now she was snowbound in a small cabin with a man who was quickly becoming much more than just her rescuer. It wasn't proper, she knew. An unmarried woman staying unchaperoned with a bachelor would cause a scandal in San Francisco. But here, in this vast wilderness where survival often depended on mutual aid, different rules applied. Besides, Declan had been nothing but respectful, maintaining a careful distance despite the close quarters. Yet Elizabeth couldn't deny the growing attraction she felt toward him. It wasn't just gratitude for saving her life, though that certainly formed the foundation. It was the quiet strength he exuded, the gentleness belied by his rugged exterior, the intelligence that shone in his eyes when they discussed everything from literature to politics. Across the room, she heard Declan shift on his pallet and wondered if he too lay awake, contemplating the strange twist of fate that had brought them together. The days that followed fell into a comfortable routine. Declan tended to his livestock and made repairs around the homestead, while Elizabeth kept the cabin in order and prepared meals. In the evenings, they read from Declan's small collection of books or played checkers on a handmade board. Sometimes they simply talked, sharing pieces of themselves that neither had revealed to another person in years, if ever. Elizabeth learned that Declan had grown up on a small farm in Pennsylvania, the middle son of 5 children. He had fought for the Union in the Civil War, returning home to find his wife dead and his family struggling. The memories of battle had haunted him, driving him west in search of open spaces and a fresh start. "I never intended to stay," he admitted one evening as they sat before the fire. "Thought I'd work a few seasons, save some money, then move on. But something about this land gets under your skin. The freedom of it, like you said." Elizabeth understood perfectly. Despite the harshness of the environment, there was an undeniable appeal to this untamed country. The vast skies, the rugged mountains on the horizon, the sense of possibility that seemed to permeate the very air it was intoxicating. On the 4th day after the storm broke, a path was cleared to Laramie and Declan rode into town for supplies. He returned with not only provisions but also a letter for Elizabeth, forwarded from the telegraph office in Red Bluff. "It's from my aunt," Elizabeth exclaimed, breaking the seal eagerly. Her eyes scanned the familiar handwriting and her expression softened. "She was worried, of course, but is relieved I'm safe. She says her illness was exaggerated by her doctor, who apparently believes women my aunt's age should be treated as invalids." Declan chuckled. "I take it she doesn't agree with that assessment." "Not in the slightest," Elizabeth confirmed with a smile. "She says she's perfectly capable of managing on her own and insists I needn't rush to her side, though she would welcome a visit when travel is safer." She lowered the letter, a small frown creasing her brow. "I'm not sure what to do now. The purpose of my journey seems less urgent yet." "Yet you've come all this way," Declan finished for her. "The stage should be running by next week. No need to make a decision today." Elizabeth nodded, grateful for his understanding. The truth was she felt conflicted. Part of her wanted to continue to Red Bluff, to see her beloved aunt and perhaps explore more of the Western Territories. But another part, growing stronger each day, was reluctant to leave the small homestead and the man who had become so important to her in such a short time. The day of the social arrived bright and clear, the recent blizzard nothing but a crystalline memory on the landscape. Elizabeth spent extra time preparing, washing her hair with the lavender soap Declan had thoughtfully purchased in town and carefully pressing her blue traveling dress. When she emerged from behind the privacy screen Declan had rigged for her, his expression made all her efforts worthwhile. He stood speechless for a moment, his eyes traveling from her neatly arranged hair to the simple dress that nonetheless highlighted her slender figure. "You look beautiful," he said finally, his voice rough with sincerity. Elizabeth felt herself blushing under his appreciative gaze. Declan himself had made an effort, she noted, wearing a clean white shirt under his best waistcoat, his hair neatly combed and beard trimmed. "You clean up rather well yourself," she teased, trying to lighten the suddenly charged atmosphere between them. The journey to Laramie took over an hour by wagon, but Elizabeth hardly noticed the time passing as she and Declan talked and laughed, pointing out interesting sights along the way. The town itself was larger than she had expected, with several streets of wooden buildings including a hotel, general store, saloon, and the schoolhouse where the social was being held. As they entered the festively decorated room, Elizabeth was momentarily overwhelmed by the curious glances directed their way. Declan Yates was apparently not a regular at social gatherings, and his arrival with an unknown woman caused quite a stir. "Declan Yates, as I live and breathe." A booming voice called out. A large man with an impressive mustache approached, slapping Declan on the back. "We were beginning to think you'd turned into a complete hermit." "Evening, Sheriff," Declan replied good-naturedly. "May I present Miss Elizabeth Kincaid?" "Elizabeth, this is Sheriff Thomas Blackwood." "Miss Kincaid," the sheriff acknowledged with a tip of his hat. "I understand we have Declan here to thank for your rescue. Nasty business getting caught in a blizzard." "Yes," Elizabeth agreed. "I'm extremely fortunate that Mr. Yates found me when he did." Other introductions followed in quick succession: the storekeeper and his wife, the schoolteacher, several ranchers and their families. Elizabeth tried to keep track of names and relationships, but it was a dizzying experience after days of isolation with just Declan for company. "It's a lot to take in," Declan murmured sympathetically as he guided her toward the refreshment table. "Small towns run on gossip, and you're the most interesting thing to happen here in months." Elizabeth laughed. "I'm hardly that exciting." "I beg to differ," Declan replied, his eyes holding hers for a moment longer than was strictly proper. The evening progressed pleasantly, with a fiddler and banjo player providing lively tunes for dancing. Elizabeth found herself swept up in the festivities, dancing not only with Declan but also with several other men who eagerly sought her hand. She noticed more than a few speculative glances exchanged among the women present, and whispered conversations that ceased when she approached. During a break in the dancing, Elizabeth found herself beside the schoolteacher, a pleasant woman named Mary who had come west 2 years earlier. "We don't often see Declan at these gatherings," Mary commented, watching as Declan conversed with several men across the room. "He keeps to himself mostly. Good man, though always the first to help when someone's in need." "Yes, I've discovered that firsthand," Elizabeth replied warmly. Mary studied her with kind but perceptive eyes. "It's none of my business, of course, but, well, folks are talking about your situation." Elizabeth stiffened slightly. "I'm sure they are, but Mr. Yates has been nothing but a gentleman." "Oh, I never suggested otherwise." Mary hastened to assure her. "It's just that." "Well, you should know that Almer Reed over there has had her eye on Declan for years. She's the widow of a rancher who died last spring, and she's made it clear she's looking for a new husband." Following Mary's discreet nod, Elizabeth observed a handsome woman in her 30s, dressed in a fashionable burgundy gown, who was currently engaged in animated conversation with Declan. Something uncomfortable twisted in Elizabeth's stomach as she watched Alma place a familiar hand on Declan's arm, laughing at something he said. "I see," Elizabeth said, striving for a neutral tone. "Well, Mr. Yates is free to court whomever he chooses. Our arrangement is purely temporary until the stage runs again." Mary looked unconvinced but kindly changed the subject to Elizabeth's journey and plans. Elizabeth responded automatically, but her attention remained on Declan and the widow, who had moved to a quieter corner for their conversation. It was irrational to feel hurt, Elizabeth told herself firmly. She had known Declan for less than 2 weeks. They had no understanding, no promises between them. Yet the sight of him smiling down at another woman caused an ache she couldn't easily dismiss. When the dancing resumed, Elizabeth accepted the hand of a young rancher named Peter, throwing herself into the lively reel with perhaps more enthusiasm than was warranted. She was breathless by the end, and excused herself to step outside for some fresh air. The night was cold but clear, stars blazing in a velvet sky with a brightness Elizabeth had never witnessed in the city. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders, breathing deeply of the crisp air, trying to sort through her jumbled emotions. Elizabeth. She turned to find Declan standing in the doorway, concern evident in his expression. "Are you all right?" he asked, moving to join her. "You disappeared so suddenly." "I'm fine," she assured him. "Just needed a moment away from the crowd. It's been a while since I've been around so many people." Declan nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Would you like to go home? We can leave whenever you're ready." Home. The word caught Elizabeth off guard. In just a few days, she had come to think of Declan's cabin as home, a realization both comforting and unsettling. "No, I'm enjoying myself," she said, forcing a smile. "Don't let me keep you from your conversations." Something in her tone must have betrayed her, for Declan's brow furrowed. "You mean Alma? She was just telling me about a mare she's looking to sell." "I've been thinking of expanding my small herd." "Oh," Elizabeth felt foolish for her jealousy. "Mary mentioned that Mrs. Reed has been interested in you for some time." Declan's expression shifted to one of surprise, then amusement. "Did she now? Well, Alma's a fine woman, but—" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "My interests lie elsewhere." The intensity in his gaze as he spoke left Elizabeth in little doubt as to his meaning. Her heart fluttered in response, and for a moment they stood in silence, the air between them charged with unspoken feelings. The moment was broken by the schoolhouse door opening as several more guests stepped out for air. Declan offered Elizabeth his arm with a small smile. "Shall we go back inside? I believe this next dance is ours." Elizabeth placed her hand on his arm, feeling the solid strength of him beneath her fingers. "Lead the way, Mr. Yates." For the remainder of the evening, Declan rarely left her side. They danced together more often than was perhaps strictly proper, but if anyone disapproved, Elizabeth couldn't bring herself to care. The way Declan looked at her as they moved through the figures of the dance made her feel beautiful, desirable, and cherished. It was well past midnight when they finally began the journey home, Elizabeth drowsy but content beside Declan in the wagon. The stars overhead and the rhythmic creaking of the wheels created a peaceful backdrop to their quiet conversation. "Did you enjoy yourself?" Declan asked, his eyes on the road ahead. "Very much," Elizabeth replied honestly. "Everyone was so welcoming. It's quite different from socials in San Francisco." "How so?" Elizabeth considered the question. "Less pretense, I suppose." In the city, such gatherings are often about displaying wealth or making advantageous connections. Here, it seemed genuinely about community people enjoying each other's company. Declan nodded. "That's one thing I've always appreciated about this place. When it comes down to it, we all need each other to survive out here. Makes for a certain kind of honesty." They lapsed into comfortable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. As the wagon crested a small rise, Elizabeth gasped at the sight that greeted them: the vast Wyoming landscape bathed in silvery moonlight, the distant mountains like sentinels against the star-studded sky. "It's magnificent," she breathed. Declan drew the wagon to a halt, allowing them to appreciate the view. "This is why I stay," he said softly. "Moments like this." Elizabeth turned to look at him, finding his gaze already on her, his expression open and vulnerable in a way she hadn't seen before. "Elizabeth," he began, his voice low and serious. "I know you've only been here a short time and you have plans to continue your journey, but He faltered, then seemed to gather his courage. "I've grown very fond of you, more than fond. I know it's sudden and perhaps unwelcome, but I'd be a fool not to speak my mind while I have the chance." Elizabeth's heart raced at his words, joy and uncertainty warring within her. "It's not unwelcome," she whispered. "Not at all. But yes, it is sudden. We've known each other such a short time." "Some things don't need time," Declan replied, reaching out to take her gloved hand in his. "Sometimes you just know. When I found you in that blizzard, something in me recognized you, as strange as that sounds, like I'd been waiting for you without knowing it." The simple sincerity of his declaration moved Elizabeth deeply. In the city, men couched their intentions in flowery phrases and social niceties. Declan's straightforward honesty was refreshing and infinitely more affecting. "I feel it too," she admitted. "This connection between us. But my life is in San Francisco. My teaching position, my friends." "I understand," Declan said, though disappointment shadowed his features. "I'm not asking for promises, Elizabeth, just Would you consider the possibility of a different future than the one you planned? That's all I ask." Elizabeth studied his face in the moonlight, the strong jaw, the kind eyes, the weather-lined features that had become so dear to her in such a short time. Could she imagine a life here in this wild country? A life with this man who had saved her not just from the storm, but from a future of safe predictability. "Yes," she said finally, her voice stronger. "I'll consider it." The smile that broke across Declan's face was like the sun emerging from behind clouds. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, he leaned toward her. Elizabeth met him halfway, her eyes fluttering closed as their lips touched in a gentle, questioning kiss. It was brief but perfect, a promise, a beginning. When they drew apart, Declan's expression was one of wonder and barely contained joy. "We should get home," he said softly. "It's late. Home." There was that word again, but this time Elizabeth embraced it, along with all the possibilities it contained. The next few days passed in a haze of newfound happiness, as Elizabeth and Declan explored their growing feelings for one another. They were careful, both aware of the constraints of propriety despite their isolated situation, but small touches and meaningful glances conveyed what words often couldn't. They spoke of the future tentatively at first, then with increasing confidence. Declan shared his dreams of expanding his small ranch, adding more cattle and perhaps horses. Elizabeth told him of her desire to continue teaching, perhaps in Laramie, and to write about her experiences in the West. "There's no reason you couldn't do both," Declan assured her. "Laramie's growing. They could use another teacher, especially one with your education." "And my writing?" Elizabeth asked, curious about his response. "I think it's a fine idea," Declan replied sincerely. "People back east should know what life is really like out here, the hardships and the beauty both. Who better to tell them than someone who's experienced both worlds?" His support touched Elizabeth deeply. So many men of her acquaintance in San Francisco had viewed her ambitions as charming follies at best, inappropriate distractions from womanly duties at worst. Declan's matter-of-fact acceptance of her dreams as valid and achievable was yet another reason her heart was tilting inexorably toward a future with him. On the morning of her 10th day at the homestead, news arrived that the stagecoach would resume its route the following day. The announcement, delivered by a passing neighbor, cast a shadow over the bright happiness of recent days. "I could still go to Red Bluff," Elizabeth said that evening as they sat before the fire. "Visit my aunt as planned, then perhaps." She hesitated, the words come back on the tip of her tongue but suddenly difficult to voice. "Perhaps what?" Declan prompted gently. Elizabeth met his gaze, seeing in his eyes the same uncertainty she felt. They had spoken of possibilities, of feelings, but made no definite plans. Now faced with an imminent decision, the future seemed suddenly precarious. "I don't know," she admitted softly. "Everything is happening so fast. 2 weeks ago I didn't even know you existed. Now I can't imagine." She trailed off, overwhelmed by the depth of her feelings. Declan moved from his chair to kneel before her, taking her hands in his. "Elizabeth, I know this is sudden. By all conventional standards, it's madness. But I've lived enough to know that happiness doesn't always come in expected packages or on a convenient schedule." He paused, drawing a deep breath. "I'm not a wealthy man. I can't offer you the comforts of city life, but I can promise to work every day to build something good with you. I can promise to cherish you, respect you, support your dreams as you would mine. I can promise to love you if you'll let me." Tears filled Elizabeth's eyes at the simple eloquence of his proposal, for that's what it was, she realized, though he hadn't explicitly asked the question. "Are you asking me to marry you, Declan Yates?" she whispered. A smile tugged at his lips. "I suppose I am, though not very skillfully." "Elizabeth Kincaid, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The answer rose from her heart without hesitation. "Yes, yes, I will." Declan's face transformed with joy as he rose and pulled her gently to her feet into his arms. This kiss was different from their first, deeper, more certain, a promise sealed between them. When they finally parted, Elizabeth rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I should still go to Red Bluff," she said softly. "I need to see my aunt, explain my decision in person. She raised me, after all." Declan nodded, his chin brushing the top of her head. "Of course. Family matters. I would think less of you if you didn't honor that obligation." Elizabeth looked up at him, love welling in her heart for this man who understood her so well after such a short acquaintance. "Would you come with me? Meet my aunt. We could be married there with her blessing." The suggestion clearly surprised and pleased him. "I'd be honored. I've never been to Montana, and I'd like to meet the woman who raised such an extraordinary niece." They decided that Elizabeth would take the stage as planned, while Declan would follow a few days later after making arrangements for his livestock to be tended in his absence. The separation would be brief, just long enough for Elizabeth to prepare her aunt for the news of her unexpected engagement. The following morning dawned clear and cold. Declan drove Elizabeth to the stage station in Laramie, both of them quieter than usual, each lost in thoughts of the coming separation and the future that awaited beyond it. As they waited for the stage, Declan handed Elizabeth a small package. "Something to remember me by," he said with a slight smile. Unwrapping the brown paper, Elizabeth found a beautifully carved wooden box, small enough to fit in her palm. When she opened it, a delicate melody began to play, a music box crafted with obvious skill and care. "It was my mother's," Declan explained. "One of the few things I brought west with me. I've been meaning to fix the mechanism for years. Working on it these past few nights gave me something to do besides worry about you leaving." Touched beyond words, Elizabeth cradled the precious gift. "Declan, I can't accept this. It's a family heirloom." "And you're about to become family," he replied simply. "Besides, it's just a loan, something to keep you company until I join you in Red Bluff." The distant sound of the approaching stagecoach interrupted their moment. Passengers began gathering their belongings, preparing to board. "I'll be there in less than a week," Declan promised, helping Elizabeth with her valise. "Sooner if I can manage it." "I'll be counting the days," she replied, struggling to maintain her composure. It was foolish to be so emotional about a brief separation, especially when they had known each other such a short time. Yet the prospect of leaving Declan, even temporarily, filled her with an unexpected sense of loss. As the stage pulled up in a cloud of dust, Declan drew her slightly away from the crowd. "I love you, Elizabeth Kincaid," he said quietly, the first time he had spoken the words directly. "Remember that." "I love you too," she whispered back, the declaration both frightening and exhilarating in its newness. "Be safe on your journey." Their goodbye kiss was brief but tender, mindful of the curious eyes around them. Then Elizabeth was boarding the stage, finding a seat by the window where she could see Declan standing tall and steady, his hand raised in farewell as the coach lurched into motion. As Laramie receded behind them and the Wyoming landscape unfurled before her, Elizabeth opened the music box, letting its sweet melody soothe the ache of separation. In her heart, she knew she was traveling not away from home, but toward a new definition of it, one that included a small cabin, a vast sky, and a man who had found her frozen in a blizzard and warmed her back to life in more ways than one. The journey to Red Bluff proved less eventful than her ill-fated trip from Laramie, though not without its challenges. The roads were still rough from the recent blizzard, making for a jarring ride, and the accommodations at the stations where they stopped overnight were basic at best. But Elizabeth hardly noticed these discomforts, her mind occupied with thoughts of Declan and the unexpected turn her life had taken. When the stagecoach finally rolled into Red Bluff 3 days later, Elizabeth was exhausted but eager to see her aunt. Margaret Keller was waiting at the station, a tall, imposing figure with silver-streaked dark hair and the same green eyes Elizabeth had inherited. "My dear girl," Margaret exclaimed, embracing Elizabeth tightly. "When we heard your stage had been caught in the blizzard, I feared the worst. Thank God that kind rancher found you." "Aunt Margaret, you look wonderful," Elizabeth said, stepping back to examine the older woman. "Not at all like someone at death's door, as your doctor implied," Margaret snorted dismissively. "That old fool thought a touch of bronchitis would finish me off. I've survived 40 Montana winters. It'll take more than a cough to lay me low." As they walked to Margaret's comfortable home at the edge of town, Elizabeth shared an abbreviated version of her adventure, describing the blizzard and Declan's timely rescue. She said nothing yet of their engagement, wanting to broach that subject in private. Margaret's home was a substantial 2-story structure, reflecting her status as one of Red Bluff's founding citizens. Inside, It was filled with an eclectic mix of frontier practicality and treasures gathered over decades, Navajo rugs beside delicate porcelain from Boston, handmade quilts draped over an elegant settee that had made the journey west by wagon 30 years earlier. "Now," Margaret said once they were settled in her parlor with tea, "tell me the real story. You've been practically vibrating with suppressed emotion since you arrived." Elizabeth laughed, unsurprised by her aunt's perceptiveness. "I've never been able to hide anything from you, have I?" "Not since you were 6 and broke my favorite vase," Margaret confirmed with a twinkle in her eye. "Out with it, child." Taking a deep breath, Elizabeth recounted the full tale of her time with Declan, the days spent recovering in his cabin, their growing connection, the social in Laramie, and finally, his proposal and her acceptance. Margaret listened without interruption, her expression giving away nothing until Elizabeth finished speaking. "Well," the older woman said finally, "I must say this is unexpected." Elizabeth tensed, prepared for disapproval. "I know it seems hasty," Margaret interrupted. "Of course it's hasty. You've known the man less than 2 weeks, but life out here has a way of accelerating matters of the heart." A smile softened her stern features. "Your uncle proposed to me after knowing me exactly 10 days. My parents were scandalized, but it was the best decision I ever made." Relief washed over Elizabeth. "Then you're not opposed to the match. I reserve judgment until I meet this Declan Yates," Margaret replied. "But I trust your intelligence and your heart, Elizabeth. You've never been one for rash decisions." "If you believe this man is worthy of you, I'm inclined to believe it too. He'll be arriving within a week," Elizabeth told her, happiness bubbling up inside her. "He wanted to come with me but needed to make arrangements for his ranch first." Margaret nodded approvingly. "A man who takes his responsibilities seriously, that's a good sign." She studied Elizabeth for a moment, her expression softening. "You look different, you know. There's a light in you I haven't seen before." Elizabeth felt herself blushing. "I'm happy, Aunt Margaret. In a way I didn't know was possible." "Then I'm happy for you, my dear," the older woman said simply. "Now we have a wedding to plan, don't we?" The next few days passed in a flurry of activity as Elizabeth and her aunt prepared for both Declan's arrival and the wedding that would follow. Margaret introduced Elizabeth to Red Bluff's small society, and Elizabeth was pleased to find the townspeople as welcoming as those in Laramie had been. She also spent time writing letters to her friends in San Francisco, explaining her decision to remain in the West. Some would understand, she knew. Others would be baffled by her choice to marry a rancher she'd known for such a short time rather than return to her established life in the city. But as she wrote of Declan and the future they planned together, Elizabeth felt more certain than ever that she was making the right choice. 5 days after her arrival in Red Bluff, Elizabeth was helping her aunt prepare dinner when a knock came at the door. Her heart leapt. Though she tried to temper her expectations, it was probably just a neighbor, or perhaps the dressmaker delivering the simple wedding dress they had commissioned. But when Margaret opened the door, it was Declan who stood on the threshold, his hat in his hands, looking travel-worn but wonderfully, gloriously familiar. "Mr. Yates, I presume?" Margaret said, her tone formal but her eyes warm with approval as she assessed the tall cowboy. "Yes, madam," Declan replied respectfully. "You must be Mrs. Keller. It's an honor to meet you." Before Margaret could respond, Elizabeth appeared in the hallway, unable to contain herself any longer. "Declan." The smile that broke across his face at the sight of her was everything Elizabeth had dreamed of during their separation. In 3 strides, he crossed to her, stopping just short of taking her in his arms, mindful of Margaret's presence. "You're early," Elizabeth said, drinking in the sight of him, the familiar lines of his face, the warmth in his brown eyes, the slight curl of hair at his collar. "Couldn't stay away," Declan admitted, his voice husky with emotion. "Made better time than I expected." Margaret cleared her throat, an amused expression on her face. "Why don't you two get reacquainted while I finish preparing dinner? Mr. Yates, you're welcome to wash up in the kitchen. I imagine you've had a long journey." As her aunt tactfully withdrew, Elizabeth finally allowed herself to step into Declan's embrace, savoring the solid strength of him, the familiar scent of leather and pine and home. "I missed you," she whispered against his chest. "I missed you too," Declan replied, his arms tightening around her. "Every mile, every hour." He drew back slightly to look at her, his expression suddenly uncertain. "You haven't changed your mind, have you, now that you've had some distance to think?" Elizabeth shook her head firmly. "Not for a moment. If anything, being away from you has only confirmed what I already knew. I love you, Declan Yates. I want to build a life with you." The relief in his eyes was quickly replaced by joy as he lowered his head to kiss her, a kiss that conveyed all the longing and love of their days apart. When they finally separated, both breathless, Elizabeth led him to the kitchen where he could freshen up before dinner. The evening that followed was one Elizabeth would treasure forever, the three of them sharing a meal. Margaret and Declan cautiously taking each other's measure at first, then gradually warming as they discovered shared values and complementary senses of humor. By the time they retired for the night, Declan to the guest room, Elizabeth to her childhood bedroom, it was clear that Margaret approved wholeheartedly of Elizabeth's choice. "He's a good man," the older woman said as she and Elizabeth washed dishes after Declan had gone upstairs. "Solid. Not full of himself like so many, but confident in who he is and the way he looks at you." Margaret smiled. "Well, it reminds me of how your uncle used to look at me." "I'm glad you approve," Elizabeth said, relief evident in her voice. "More than approve," Margaret corrected. "I'm delighted. I've worried about you, you know, feared you might settle for some stuffy professor or businessman who wouldn't appreciate your spirit. Declan Yates is exactly the kind of man I hoped you'd find, someone strong enough to stand beside you without needing to control you." Elizabeth hugged her aunt impulsively. "Thank you. Your blessing means everything to me." The wedding took place 3 days later in Red Bluff's small church, a simple but joyous affair attended by Margaret's many friends and neighbors. Elizabeth wore a dress of ivory satin with delicate lace trim, hastily but expertly altered by the local dressmaker from one of Margaret's treasured gowns. Declan, in a new suit purchased for the occasion, looked so handsome it nearly took Elizabeth's breath away as she walked down the aisle to him. The ceremony was brief, the vows traditional but spoken with such evident sincerity that more than one guest dabbed at their eyes. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, and Declan kissed his bride, Elizabeth felt a sense of rightness of homecoming that confirmed all her decisions. The celebration afterward at Margaret's house continued well into the evening, with music and dancing and more food than Elizabeth had seen in one place since leaving San Francisco. Declan proved to be an accomplished dancer, much to her delight, and they whirled together through several reels before stepping outside for a moment of quiet amid the festivities. "Happy, Mrs. Yates?" Declan asked, his arms encircling her waist as they stood in Margaret's garden under a canopy of stars. "Deliriously so, Mr. Yates," Elizabeth replied, tilting her face up for a kiss that quickly deepened into something more passionate than was strictly proper at their own wedding reception. When they reluctantly parted, Elizabeth nestled against Declan's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I still can't quite believe it," she murmured. "That blizzard could have been the end of me. Instead, it led me to you." "I've thought about that a lot," Declan admitted, his voice thoughtful. "What if I'd decided to wait out the storm instead of heading home that day? What if thunder hadn't sensed something wrong and pulled off our path? So many little decisions that could have gone differently." "But they didn't," Elizabeth said softly. "You found me, you saved me." Declan looked down at her, his expression serious. "You saved me too, you know. I was existing, not living, going through the motions day after day. Then you appeared, half frozen on my doorstep, and suddenly everything mattered again." The simple honesty of his declaration moved Elizabeth deeply. Standing on tiptoe, she kissed him again, pouring all her love and gratitude into the gesture. The sound of the door opening behind them finally forced them apart, both turning to find Margaret watching them with an indulgent smile. "I hate to interrupt," she said, "but your guests are wondering where you've disappeared to, and it's almost time for the cake." Hand in hand, the newlyweds returned to the celebration, accepting congratulations and well wishes with matching smiles that spoke volumes about their happiness. Later that night, in the privacy of the guest room that Margaret had insisted they take as their bridal chamber, Elizabeth and Declan consummated their marriage with a tenderness and passion that left them both breathless and wondering at the miracle of finding such perfect completion in another person. "I love you," Declan whispered as they lay entwined afterward, his fingers gently tracing the curve of her cheek. I'll spend the rest of my life showing you how much. I'll hold you to that promise, Elizabeth replied, her heart so full she thought it might burst. They remained in Red Bluff for 2 weeks, enjoying Margaret's hospitality and getting to know the town. Elizabeth was pleased to discover a small but vibrant community with a school, library, and newspaper, all potential outlets for her educational and writing ambitions. Margaret, for her part, seemed to grow younger and more energetic during their stay, taking obvious delight in showing Declan her favorite spots around town and regaling him with stories of the early days of settlement. "You know," she said one evening as they sat on her porch after dinner, "I've been thinking of selling this place. It's too big for just me, and the winters are getting harder each year." Elizabeth exchanged a surprised glance with Declan. "Where would you go?" A mischievous smile played at Margaret's lips. "Well, I hear Wyoming's nice. Might be pleasant to be closer to my only family." Understanding dawned on Elizabeth, joy and disbelief mingling in her expression. "Are you saying you'd consider moving near us?" "I'm considering it," Margaret confirmed. "Not right away, I have affairs to settle here, but perhaps by next spring." She looked at Declan. "If that wouldn't be an imposition, of course." "It would be an honor, Mrs. Keller," Declan replied sincerely. "My nearest neighbor is 3 miles away, but there's a nice parcel of land about a mile from our place that might suit you. Good water, protected from the worst of the wind." Margaret's eyes lit up. "That sounds promising, and please call me Margaret. We're family now." The three of them spent the rest of the evening discussing possibilities, making tentative plans for Margaret's eventual relocation. Elizabeth felt a weight lift from her heart. The one lingering concern about her new life had been leaving her beloved aunt behind. Now it seemed she might truly have everything she desired. The journey back to Wyoming was a joyous one, despite the discomforts of travel. Elizabeth and Declan were still in the honeymoon phase of their marriage, finding delight in each other's company, whether conversing or sitting in comfortable silence as the landscape rolled by. When they finally arrived at Declan's, now their homestead, Elizabeth felt a surge of emotion as the small cabin came into view. This was home now, this place where she had nearly died and then been brought back to life by the man who was now her husband. Declan helped her down from the wagon, then surprised her by sweeping her into his arms. "Welcome home, Mrs. Yates," he said, carrying her across the threshold as tradition demanded. Elizabeth laughed, wrapping her arms around his neck. "It's good to be home." That spring and summer were the happiest of Elizabeth's life. Together, she and Declan worked to improve the homestead, expanding the garden, adding a small room to the cabin, building a more substantial chicken coop. Elizabeth learned to ride, fish, and even shoot, skills she had never imagined needing in her previous life but which she embraced with enthusiasm. Declan proved to be a patient teacher and an eager student in turn, appreciating Elizabeth's knowledge of literature, history, and science. They read together in the evenings, discussed ideas, dreamed of the future. And when words gave way to touches and kisses, they discovered again and again the profound connection that had drawn them together against all odds. Elizabeth found work as an assistant at the school in Laramie, teaching 3 days a week, while also submitting articles about frontier life to several Eastern newspapers. To her delight, her pieces were well received, offering readers back east a woman's perspective on the realities of Western living. Declan's ranch prospered under their combined efforts. The small herd of cattle grew, and he added several horses, including a gentle mare named Star that became Elizabeth's own mount. They were not wealthy by any measure, but they were comfortable and, more importantly, deeply content. As autumn approached, bringing with it the first hints of the coming winter, Elizabeth discovered she was expecting a child. The news filled both her and Declan with joy tinged with the natural anxiety of first-time parents. "Do you think we're ready?" Elizabeth asked one evening as they sat before the fire, her head resting on Declan's shoulder, his hand gently cradling the slight swell of her abdomen. "I don't know if anyone's ever truly ready," Declan replied thoughtfully, "but I do know this baby will be loved beyond measure." "That seems like a good start." Elizabeth smiled, covering his hand with her own. "I've been thinking about names. If it's a boy, perhaps William, after my father, William Yates." Declan tested the name. "It's strong, I like it, and if it's a girl." "Sarah," Elizabeth said softly, watching Declan's face carefully. "After your first wife, if that wouldn't be too painful for you." Emotion flickered across Declan's features, surprise, then a deep tenderness. "You would do that." "She was part of your life, part of what made you the man I love," Elizabeth explained. "I would be honored to name our daughter after her." Declan kissed her then, a kiss full of love and gratitude that left no doubt about his feelings on the matter. As winter approached once more, bringing with it the anniversary of their fateful meeting, Declan and Elizabeth prepared more thoroughly than ever for the coming blizzards. Wood was stacked high, the root cellar filled with preserved foods, and extra hay stored for the livestock. Margaret arrived from Red Bluff just before the first heavy snow, having sold her home and purchased the parcel of land Declan had suggested. Construction on her new house would begin in the spring. For now, she would winter with them in the expanded cabin. The arrangement proved ideal. Margaret's experience was invaluable as Elizabeth's pregnancy progressed, and her practical knowledge of frontier living complemented Declan's skills perfectly. The three of them formed a harmonious household, each contributing in their own way to their shared welfare. On a clear, cold morning in early February, almost exactly a year after Declan had found Elizabeth in the blizzard, their son was born. William Thomas Yates entered the world with a lusty cry, perfectly formed with a shock of dark hair and his mother's green eyes. "He's beautiful," Declan whispered, cradling his son with reverent hands while Margaret busied herself tending to Elizabeth. "Perfect. Like his father," Elizabeth replied tiredly but with a radiant smile. As Declan placed their son in her arms, Elizabeth felt a completeness, a sense of rightness that encompassed everything: this child, this man, this life she had never planned but which now seemed inevitable, the only possible path her heart could have followed. Later that night, as Declan sat beside the bed where Elizabeth and William slept, he reflected on the strange workings of fate. A year ago, he had been alone, a solitary man in a vast landscape, his days marked by routine and quiet resignation. Now he was surrounded by family, a wife he adored, a son who already held his heart in tiny, perfect fingers, and a mother-in-law whose wisdom and humor had enriched their lives immeasurably, all because of a blizzard, a wrong turn, a woman who had nearly frozen to death at his doorstep. Some might call it coincidence. Declan preferred to think of it as destiny. Outside, snow began to fall gently, the first flakes of a new storm. But inside, all was warmth and light, and love, a perfect shelter against whatever weather might come.